Probably the most important aspect of the dynamic simulation are the dynamic properties of stretch resistance, compression resistance, and bend resistance. We're going to look at stretch and compression resistance in this movie. I've got a scene here that's got passive follicles, and I've set the nucleus space scale appropriately so we're getting physically accurate results. We want to go ahead and open up the attribute editor. Select the hair, hit Ctrl-A to open the attribute editor, and go to the hair system shape node. And we want to go to the dynamic properties section. You'll need to scroll down a bit to get to that. And in dynamic properties, you'll see stretch and compression resistance. Currently, you'll see there's a lot of stretching. It's looking kind of unrealistic, as if the hairs are made out of rubber or something. We do want to increase these values. But before we do, I want to point out there is a switch here that says no stretch. And you're going to be tempted to turn that on because that seems like a simple way of preventing all stretching. Let me rewind the simulation. And if I enable no stretch, what you will see is that all of the passive curves and their associated strokes disappear. Basically, what's happening here is that the strokes are being cropped to the length of their associated curves. And for the purposes of this switch, passive curves have no length, and basically they get cropped down to nothing. So that's not terribly useful. You can turn that back off again. Additionally, if you're not using passive follicles and they're all active, this switch could also be an issue as well. I've got another scene to illustrate that. I'll open that. File open scene. Setting dynamic properties to no passive. And we don't need to save. I'll go ahead and select it. Go back to the hair system shape node. And if we turn no stretch on, we don't get a loss of hair, but what we see is that the tips of some of these hair clumps are starting to get kind of weird and crunchy. So if I get in really close, you can see that. Therefore, I don't recommend using this switch. Instead, what you need to do is increase the stretch resistance and compression resistance. Dolly back out again. Once again, for reference, here it is with default stretch and compression resistance of 10. For a scene like this at unity scale, we probably need to increase stretch and compression resistance up to a value of 100 or more. I'll go ahead and put in 100 for each of those two values. Rewind and play back. And now it's not stretching and bouncing so much. We are getting a little bit of overactive dynamics. We can adjust that later using damp. But currently, we've at least fixed the issue of the hair stretching too much. Before we walk away from this, we need to also take a look at the nucleus solver attributes, because in fact, these values interact with the global solver values in the nucleus node. So we want to go ahead and open that nucleus 1 node, and we want to find the solver attributes section. So you'll need to scroll down to find that and open it up. And you've got two very important attributes here, substeps and max collision iterations. Substeps is the number of calculations between each frame of the Maya timeline. So currently with the default value of 3, Nucleus is calculating 3 calculations of the position of each hair point for each frame. So we're getting 3 calculations per frame. Max collision iterations is a clamping value that reduces the number of overall calculations for the purposes of collisions. And basically, we want to set these values optimally so that the dynamic system will run smoothly, but not actually sort of overload the computer. There is an algorithm that determines what should happen under different conditions. And if you're really interested in researching that down to the nitty-gritty, there is an Autodesk white paper that you can download that's entitled Nucleus in Autodesk Maya. The way that Maya calculates the interaction between the hair system shape dynamic properties and the solver attributes values here in the nucleus node is kind of complicated, and we don't really want to go into too much detail around that. If you are really interested, you can download a white paper written by the Autodesk developers. It's called Nucleus in Autodesk Maya, and it goes into a great amount of detail about exactly how all those values interact with one another. Here, what I want to do is just give you some basic rules of thumb so that you can kind of get the simulation into the right range and then maybe adjust it slightly for your particular application. First of all, the max collision iterations. This needs to be increased. If you have a high value to stretch and compression resistance, then you won't get the benefit of that unless you increase the max collision iterations. Basically, you want max collision iterations to be somewhere in the realm of 10% of your stretch and compression resistance. So of course we set that to 100. If we go back to the hair system shape, you'll see those are set to 100. Go back to the nucleus node. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. So we'll set that to a value of 10. And if we rewind and play that back, we won't see a huge difference here. There's a very subtle difference, but we probably wouldn't notice it because we also need to play around with the substeps value. Substeps needs to be somewhere in the realm of 70 to 80% of the max collision values as a sort of rule of thumb. So we can set our substeps up to a value of 8. Rewind and play that back. And now you'll see we are getting a different behavior. And in fact, we're getting a better sort of settling of the hair on the surface. And it's actually acting a little bit more stiff, even though we didn't increase the bend resistance. And at this stage, we've actually optimized these values pretty much where they need to be. And we can move on now to bend resistance in the next movie.